So was rugby really better in the good old days? This is something I see a lot in the comments. It's something that we all think of at times. I certainly have. And I wanted to challenge myself and actually rewatch some old games and see how different are they? Were they really better in the way I thought they were? It's a very interesting exercise. I definitely recommend it to everyone. I'm going to say what my conclusions were watching some games from 2 decades ago, because that makes sense to me, because my fondest memories were when playing and also watching England in the World Cup final of 2003. So I went back and I watched that game and some other games involving England and other sides in 2003. And these are my general observations of the game back then. And I think, spoiler, the general conclusion is it wasn't quite as good as we thought. There's always positives and negatives, and really the main conclusion is rugby was different back in the good old days. Today, I think rugby is still a fantastic product. We certainly like to bash it sometimes, and we're always critical, and it's fun to be critical and analytical. But actually, when you sit back and watch the rugby for what it is, we've seen some of, I think, the best rugby I've ever seen in recent years. I remember Ireland's tour to New Zealand. I always bang on about that being some of the best rugby I've seen. In this World Cup, the quarterfinals were just sensational contests and some amazing rugby in some of those games. So I had a good look back at that famous 2003 side for England and actually had a look and said, well, was it as good as I remember? And first of all, just a few general observations about the equipment. The shirts, England were one of the first sides to have tight-fitting shirts. It was a really good innovation because when you think about it, it's just ridiculous to have loose, baggy shirts that you can grab from a mile away, and Australia still had those looser shirts. So that was an interesting one. England were actually ahead of the curve there for sure. Gloves. There's always these innovations and fads in rugby. Some of the England players were still wearing gloves. I don't really think it made any difference, but certainly all the youngsters in that age were wearing gloves. They're not there anymore, but that was an interesting one. And even before that, you had those funny nose strips, those plasters over the nose that were meant to open the airways. Funny stuff. But anyway, the shirts, the tight shirts certainly stuck. So the first thing I was looking for was, how much did the ref get involved? How much ref's whistle did we have? Because we always hear, oh, there's too much whistling in the game these days. And I thought there was pretty much exactly the same amount. There were loads of stoppages in the games in 2003 that I watched. Certainly both sides, I thought, maybe try to get on with it a bit quicker after the whistle. I think that's definitely slowed down. Certainly getting box kicks away was quicker, forming lineouts was quicker, forming scrums was a bit quicker as well. And I think as professionalism has marched on, coaches realise that actually slowing games down until they're perfectly organised, say at the scrum or the line-out or the box kick, was beneficial. And the officials and World Rugby has let that drag out, and now they're trying to pull it back in. So I'd definitely say the speed that players got on with stuff was a bit better, but certainly the amount of whistling in the game I thought was just as bad as it is now. So let's get on to one of the main parts of the game, the breakdown, rucks. Now, I always hear about rucks being a bit lawless now, a bit of a mess now, but I urge you, look back at rucks in the good old days, in this case 20 years ago, and they were an absolute mess. A coach looking back at that, a modern coach looking back 20 years ago would go, what the hell's going on? People all over the place, definitely loads of infractions going on everywhere. I wouldn't say the ruck was any cleaner. In fact, I'd say in general, the game was actually a lot messier. Now, one of the interesting observations at rucks is I thought in general, both teams committed more players to the ruck than they do now. Obviously, you have to respond to the other team. If a defensive team is putting a lot of players in the ruck, you're obviously going to put more attackers in the ruck. But I think the systems definitely were designed to have more players securing rucks, less backs securing rucks. And something we see now is teams realising they can actually secure rucks with less players, certainly less forwards, sharing it out amongst the forwards and backs, trying to create quicker ball with less players. That's definitely a big change, whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing. I definitely think that's something that has happened. And also, the rucking positions weren't quite as good. In fact, I think positions overall, in the maul, in the scrum, they just weren't quite as good. As we've got more professional, and the coaches have cracked right down with video analysis, biomechanical analysis to get the perfect positions in these rucks and in these scrums. Certainly a lot better than even 20 years ago. So I'd say the technique has improved there. What about the skills? Passing. I hear a lot of people say, the skills were so much better back then. But I urge you, go and have a look. Again, not bagging anyone in that team of 2003, but their passes weren't as good as they are now. Skills in all teams has gone through the roof, especially the forwards. In England, Neil Back was known as the best passer in the pack, but have a look at his passes. They're a little bit wobbly. They're not the best. Look at some of the passes from forwards these days. They're absolutely on the money, as good as Back's. Yeah, the passing is better. Even our scrum half Matt Dawson, who, to be fair, his strength was kind of the running game, the instinctive game, his passes weren't the best. They were a bit high and wobbly. The famous pass for the drop goal was actually to the wrong foot of Johnny Wilkinson. Again, not bagging these players, some of my absolute idols, but look at the passing from the old days. It's simply not as good. Now, what about tackling? Well, one massive difference was lots more low tackling. The go-to tackle was the waist-high tackle. We did see higher tackles 20 years ago, but generally it's after someone had got them low, then you'd go high to try and maybe dislodge the ball or put a dominant hit in. Now, of course, with low tackles, players go to ground a lot quicker, so you could get quicker attacking ball. Hence why, modern players tackle a lot higher to try and slow that ball down. But it's a definite difference. If you prefer lower tackles, you would have preferred it 20 years ago. From watching those games in 2003, another defensive thing that has changed is line speed. Goodness me, line speed has gone through the roof. Look back at those games in 2003, the line speed was okay, but defensive coaches these days would be absolutely tearing them to pieces because it was just so much slower. So defensive line speed is absolutely crazy these days. It's amazing the difference. Go back and watch. You'll see the improvement if you think line speed is an improvement. Then let's look at the scrums, and I'd love to know your thoughts here, but just my observations is, yes, the scrums formed a lot quicker. However, if a modern scrummaging coach went and watched those scrums 20 years ago, they'd have absolute kittens. Very unstable, wobbling all over the place. Body positions have definitely improved. And also the laws for safety, I think they've improved as well. You had that massive gap between the front rows. They would collide with great force, very dangerous, so they have sorted that out. So in some ways, actually scrummaging might be better. Of course, in many other ways, it's still very frustrating. Looking at the line-outs, and yeah, they were quite similar actually, but a few things stood out. One, the quality of line-out throwing these days is just better, and also those body positions in the maul, the tightness of the maul, I think is a bit better as well. So just that professionalism creeping in more and more. Then on to kicking. I was really interested to have a look at this, and kicking in the modern game is very powerful, probably too powerful, and there definitely were less box kicks in the game 20 years ago. The box kick has come really into it as a way of kicking to compete. In fact, kicking to compete was definitely less. There were longer kicks back then. There was still some kicking to compete, of course, but it's more and more these days, I would say. And definitely in general, from kicks, there was more tendency to run the ball, I'd say, than a kick battle. But it's marginal, but definitely, I think, a greater go-to run the ball from both sides. Then on to attack, and you could see the modern attack evolving for sure. But attacks these days definitely have more layers to them, more dummy lines, more misses behind, definitely more options. I mean, it was still very exciting back then, but you can see the complexity these days is a lot higher. So if you like that complexity, modern rugby is a bit better in that respect. Now, of course, some things stay pretty consistent. For example, scrummaging, very, very important. If your scrum gets demolished, it's really hard for you to win. If you don't have a good kicker, a good goal kicker, a kicker out of hand, you're going to struggle to win. I was watching back a game between England and New Zealand because it was one I was live at, and definitely New Zealand really struggled with one of their best playmakers of all time, Carlos Spencer, but not the best kicker, and he really struggled in that game, part of the reason why England won. And we've even seen it in this World Cup. If you don't have a goal kicker, you're going to struggle. South Africa swapped in Pollard very late in. That made a big difference. Now, in summary, whether you prefer the game 20, 30, 40 years ago is of course subjective, but the game has changed so much. It's very hard to say one is better than the other. I think it's just good to enjoy the time you're in. Certainly players playing right now will be having the time of their lives, and they'll be looking back at this period with fondness, probably saying rugby wasn't as good as it was in my day. But of course, it's good to constantly strive for improvement, constantly be on guard for those influences that we think are negative to the game we want to see. And of course, we need to keep on doing that. But with more and more scrutiny on the game, I think it's easy to get caught in this negative spiral. I think enjoy the rugby you're watching and playing right now, and look back and enjoy the old rugby as well, but maybe it wasn't quite as good as you remember it. Anyway, I'd love to know all your thoughts on that, maybe a few controversial things in there, but go back and watch those games first before you comment, because I think you may be surprised by what you find. Anyway, if you like those sorts of videos, please do consider subscribing, liking the video. It all helps. Love to know what you think, and I'll catch you next time.